regional and foreign resources of economic diversification in the Gulf states. We're going to start with Dr. Abdullah Baaboud, who is a professor, chair in the International College of Research and a visiting fellow and the chair of the State of Qatar in the Islamic Area Studies at the Faculty of International Research and Education at Waseda University, Tokyo. He is also an adjunct professor in the Gulf Studies Center at Qatar University, holds a PhD in International Political Economy from the University of Cambridge, UK. So would like to give him the floor. I was told 15 minutes. Okay, 20 minutes then. Microphone, please. Dr. Baaboud. Good morning to you all. And I would like to thank Dr. Sahar for the kind introduction. And I would like also to thank Al Arabi Center and the Konrad Adenauer Center. And I am honored to be amongst the panelists here to talk about economic development and economic diversification in the GCC. And I would like to talk about how we can reach regional cooperation and its importance for economic cooperation. We have listened yesterday to the great papers that have been presented, papers that talked about economic diversifications, mechanisms of as to how to reach economic diversification, its importance for the region, and why there is a need for such diversification. And also we talked about methodologies, ways of management, interests for economic diversification, and also how to prepare human capital for such an end. I'm not going to be lengthy in my intro, but I'm going to be brief and talk about economic diversification. So we are in dire need for economic diversification because we rely on one business model for development, one resource for development. Any economic diversification should take into account the region. So we have to understand that we cannot achieve development in a country in isolation of the remaining region. We have to have cooperation amongst the countries and states of this region. Based on what I have read, when it comes to policies of economic diversification, these policies have started since the 70s, and that the resources that the region rely on are depleting. That is why we need to have new views and new mechanisms of diversification. So there is a missing component, which is regional cooperation and also regional integrity. So only two presentations refer to regional cooperation, particularly at the level of the GCC, but all lessons on developments say that development can only be achieved if it covers the whole region. These are lessons learned from different regions, whether in the East or West, even the great powers, including the United States of America, including EU countries, including Asian countries, and so on. All these countries attempt to carry out regional integrity and cooperation. And we have so many examples of regional organizations that have started on the basis of achieving regional cooperation, such as EPIC, Asian Pacific region. We have the NAFTA organization. We have the EU, which is the most important example when it comes to regional integrity. Also, we have so many other examples from the East. We have the ASEAN group. These countries were able to forge regional organizations and groups in order to achieve the development they aim to have. So countries in this region, they want to achieve economic integrity, but such a will has not been made clear. So why regional integrity? Why regional cooperation and complementarity? Because, as we have said, the development in the region would be reflected and would manifest on the different or in the different countries. So when we have high waters, this is not going to affect only the particular region where this is happening. So it would affect the whole area. So that is why there has been an idea that talked about loving the neighbor, dealing and cooperating with neighbors for everybody to benefit, to have win-win situations where all parties would be benefiting from what is happening. So when we talk about countries in this region, these countries and states are very small. Their economies are small. So when they cooperate, markets will open. So cooperation will enhance, will enlarge the size of the economy, the size of the market, and also the size of investments. When investors come and know that they're going to be investing in a region that has a large market, this is going to be an encouraging factor for the investor, whether this investor comes from inside the region or outside the region. We have to know that there are a number of economic and non-economic challenges that the region faces. So no country can face these challenges in isolation of the other countries in the region. So we talk about challenges such as climate change, for instance. So no country on its own can deal with such a matter individually. There should be regional cooperation. There are no projects that can be successful without regional cooperation. Have there been attempts to achieve regional cooperation? Yes, there have been such attempts. So the first form of regional cooperation, regional integrity, worldwide is the League of Arab States. The League of Arab States was established before the EU, before the idea of steel group in Europe. That was in 1945. In 1945, the League of Arab States was the first regional group worldwide, approximately, that was established. And there have been steps that have been undertaken. After that, we have had the Social and Economic Council has been established. And perhaps you have heard of the attempts to establish the GAFTA, the Arab Common Markets. So this remained ink on paper. So the idea behind such an attempt was to have a kind of a common Arab market that would join all Arab states, where tariffs would be reduced, taxes would be reduced, borders would be open between and amongst Arab countries. This was not achieved. Unfortunately, we were not able to witness such an achievement, and I do not think that even our generation would have such a chance. So this remained only a slogan. This remained only a way to perhaps try to invest in institutions that would be to no avail. It would be unjust to say that the League of Arab States has not achieved anything. Yes, it has achieved some things, but not up to the aspirations of the people, even economically and socially. So politicians might disagree with each other, but they worked in order to open markets, to have economic cooperation amongst and between the different countries of the League. Also, we have the Grand Maghreb Union. I do not think that we have enough time to talk about this catastrophe. Also, there was another organization that saw light and was nipped in the bud, which is the Maghreb Union between Egypt, Arab Union, sorry, I apologize, between Egypt, Iraq, and Yemen, and Jordan and Yemen. So the League of Arab States was in a very difficult situation in that time, and there were so many challenges in the region at that particular time. And it was necessary to have a group, to establish a group in the GCC region in order to protect the region and in order to achieve cooperation amongst the countries of the region. The Gulf Cooperation Council has achieved many things, and unfortunately, we have seen many attempts made in the Arab world, but the GCC remains the most successful formula. We do not know where it is heading, but so far it is considered the most successful union or cooperation. Since it was established in the 80s, it has been transformed into a free market, common market amongst the countries of this region. And perhaps you do not know the different secrets of this matter, but not all countries of the GCC have agreed on one unified tariff. And the process is very easy. It could have been solved by a very young student. So to have a certain tariff that would be divided amongst the different countries, so each one has its own tariff, and then come up with an average tariff to be used by all countries, a common tariff, sorry. So we have Saudi Arabia had the highest tariff and Dubai had the lowest tariff, and they stayed for decades until the EU pressured the Gulf, and they said if you want to have a free trade, you have to have one common tariff, and they were forced to agree and have one common and unified tariff. And we had also a tariffs union, and also there were talks about having a currency, unified currency amongst the different countries of the GCC, and also talking about the common GCC market initiative that was also signed in 2008. And what does this initiative say? It is considered the most important agreement that was signed by GCC countries. And it was the step that could have led to other steps in the future, which is a transformation that would lead to complete economic integrity and economic and perhaps even political union. So this agreement in general was calling for the liberalization of commerce and trade, and also to liberalize movement of individuals, of capital and merchandise. So these were the most important agreements that had been signed by the GCC. So the GCC is a regional formula or system, and this system relies on three components. So the will to cooperate. Second, agreements that are signed between countries. And the third component is trust in those agreements. So what has happened as a result of the recent GCC crisis is in contradiction with all these agreements. So borders have been closed between GCC countries. The GCC countries did not take part in taking such a decision. So this decision is a joint decision that was issued by the Supreme Council of the GCC, and it was adopted by the Council, and anything to do with the agreements should be referred to the Council. It is the Supreme Council that should decide upon such matters. All these things were ignored, and this has led to what we have seen. And thank God things have gone or come back to normal. I very sadly they say that the wounds are very, very deep amongst people and economists. So how can you do what you have done to all these agreements? And what is even worse than that, GCC countries were negotiating with the outside world as one unified entity, which gives it strength as a union in its negotiations. It was negotiating with the EU, with China, with the US, with all powers, with all states of the world. The GCC used to negotiate as one power, as one union, and it was aiming to sign free trade agreements. And now the foreign or external partners do not trust this system or this union, because these agreements can be made dysfunctional, inoperative in one day, all of a sudden. And therefore, there was no trust from the part of external partners. So the disagreements between ASEAN are even worse than what we have now. But when it comes to economic matters, they cannot take matters lightly, particularly that there are agreements that have been signed between the countries of ASEAN. So this leads to a lack of trust amongst investors inside the GCC and from outside the GCC. Unfortunately, the GCC has not developed. It was established and built in a very short period of time because there was a need for such an establishment, but the mechanisms and legislations and laws have not developed. And as an example, there is no GCC common court, even when it comes to matters to do with the agreements that have been signed by members of the GCC. So if a state or a country has a complaint or a grievance when it comes to GCC common work or integrity, if integration, so if they want to place a complaint, they wouldn't be able to do that because they wouldn't be able to have any litigation before a constitutional court or a common court in the GCC. So this is the situation we have now. So we have leaderships that lead the region in their own way, in the way they see suitable, but unfortunately, they did not and they would not open or give the opportunity to the economy to develop for internal reasons. Each and every time they come up with a developmental model that is strange and is in disagreement and contradiction with the previous model, and the private sector that should be the leading component for development. It is just something that is imposing itself on the governmental sector. So the private sector would not be the leading engine for development. And also, we have regional countries such as Iran, non-Arab countries. Also, we have India, we have Turkey, and we see that there are political differences and rifts that have impacted negatively economic cooperation. We are in need more than any time before for economic cooperation. So we can only achieve that if we cooperate with each other, if we open up on all other states. So it is time now. And despite all the challenges, we have to have the opportunity to think as to how we can achieve economic integration and also economic cooperation. So these joint projects are more important. These are going to be the leverage for this region to achieve stability and development. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Abdullah. Now we have Mr. Musalam Saeed Masan. He will be also speaking about economic diversification in Gulf countries. Mr. Muslim is the Deputy Secretary General at the Oman National Council, the Parliament, and he is a graduate of Bedfordshire University in the UK, and he has worked for different departments of the Shura Council. He is a graduate of the Sultan Qaboos University, and he has many publications to his name. In the name of God, the most merciful, the most compassionate, and all praise be to Allah, Lord of the universe, and may the blessings of God be upon His Messenger. I thank Dr. Abdullah, who has preceded me in speaking in this session. I enjoyed his lecture. My paper is to do with how to exploit foreign direct investment to expand the base of economic diversification in the GCC countries. Of course, the foreign direct investment is just a tool. In my paper, I avoided three controversial issues. By and large, papers always allude to the necessity of FDI. This is one thing. There is also a lot of argumentation on the limits and limitations of FDI, and a lot of literature focuses on that, and my paper will avoid that too. And the final issue, which pertains to the GCC, and that is the purpose and the aim behind FDI. Is it just to provide funds for public finance purposes per se, or is it a tool for technology transfer and knowledge transfer? and to build the basis for a knowledge-based economy. To my paper today will be moving in the direction of arguing that FDI can be an important tool for financing development. The reason why I'm saying that, and in the case of Oman, and especially in the last decade, according to estimates, there is a dire need for that. This was there from 1970, or in fact, in the last 50 years. I took the figures from the last 10 years only, and of course, the role of oil revenues in the public finance, and which make the foreign direct investment an important tool for development. Also, public expenditure is rigid. 70% of it is rigid, and this also uh, um makes it necessary to diversify and benefit from this tool of foreign investments. Also, the financial challenges also constitute that the trend of expenditure relies on the price of oil, and the participation of that, and we can tell from this slide, if I can get it enlarged a little bit. I think the FDI as a tool is very important. Most of the research in the Gulf and the Arab world and the world focused on the limitations and the parameters of FDI and how to enhance them to attract investment. I think most of the research focused on that, but the role of institutions was by and large ignored. The other part of the paper focused, and in the case of Oman, on legislation and regulation relating to FDI. In fact, legislation at the beginning of all the developmental experiences were rather random until we had the specific legislation on FDI. And even these laws have faced some challenges because we have not reached a stage where we have a direct unified law on FDI. Maybe some opinions say this distinction and separation may be to our advantage, and regulations more often than not do not distinguish between FDI and local investment, and therefore can be used as basis to deal with the investment in the Sultanate of Oman from 1994 onwards. The FDI legal issues were decimated and spread on different laws until an Sultani decree came into existence later on, and devised the tools and decided the minimum capital requirement for establishing an investment of this sort. These challenges were dealt through the last law issued, which is 50 over 2019, and it was not in isolation. In fact, it was decreed within a package of other legislative tools directed towards FDI for privatization, partnerships, etc. And when the laws are introduced as a package, the aim is to guarantee the inflow of FDI into the country, in this case Oman or any other member of the GCC. When we talk about the GCC as a whole, if we take a look at the indicator of the inflows of FDI, this is from the ONICTAT sources. When we look at the trend of these inflows, we will see that in the beginning of the millennium, around 2000 to 2001, there was an apparent jump, but the rest was more or less dependent on the oil sector. And so far as the FDI stock is concerned, what is the share of FDI in Oman? We see that the oil sector got some 65% of the total FDI invested in the Sultanate of Oman, according to the latest statistics of the year 2020. When we talk about economic diversification, other sectors did not get a big share. For example, the industrial or manufacturing industry or transformative industries and others. And an example, this is another indicator when we compare that to the flows in the world as a whole, we will find that these are very small percentages indeed, and according to the ONCTAD, maybe this slide explains things better. 2019, these are the figures for 2019. I took four stages, the beginning of this kind of experiments in the GCC, then with the beginning of the free zones, and around 2013, before the oil crisis, because it's difficult to measure things during the oil crisis, and the picture can be distorted a little bit when we discuss these inflows in the midst of a financial crisis in 2008, or an oil crisis from the second half of 2014, which is still, the impact of it still remains evident today. So the four samples I have taken may apply until 2019, before the pandemic, the COVID-19, and the reduction and the drop in the oil prices in the second quarter of 2020. I concluded that Asia took 37% of the FDI inflows, and Western Asia took 4% only from the world percentage. The GCC took 1.6% from the inflows in the world, Oman took zero point 0.3 in 2020. Oman took 0.4, 2019, 0.3%. This is approximately the picture as we see now. Despite that, the opportunities are there and are available because out of the 37% countries, when I analyzed them, I found that some economies had 7%, 10%, 11%. So if we take less than 1%, this means that the efforts we are, if we exert them sufficiently when it comes to providing a conducive environment, the legislative environment, and not just focus on one thing, because literature tells us that working or moving in one direction does not do much, and there may not be a need for stopping development, comprehensive development in other aspects of the economy. These figures show that the opportunity is there for the region as a whole and the countries as individual countries to get their share of FDI, whether or not we utilize them for development or use them to get high skills for the job market. The other aspect of my paper pertains to the Oman national vision. I took into consideration the national visions of other GCC countries, but focused on Oman because I have sufficient data to do that. And maybe if I compare or take into account the situation in other countries, I can only do that rather superficially and without being able to delve deeply into that. In the Oman 2030 vision is based under the pillar of economy and development, which shows that there is a clear strategic direction on activating the role of the private sector. And Dr. Yousef spoke about that yesterday, and he is better qualified than me in dealing with that aspect of things. And also, according to the 5-year plan, the 10th 5-year plan, we find a direct correlation in utilizing this tool for diversification and development in a very clear manner through the number of investment targeted, which is considered the engine that drives the train, and if this engine is moving in the right direction, then this can help the national vision to achieve its objectives. I found three important directives or indicators, like making the investment at 27% as a target, and also the percentage of FDI from GDP should be 10.9 approximately. Another target which is very important is the contribution of the private sector to reach 60%, and this will not be achieved unless through direct reliance on FDI as well as local investment and of course government investment. I tried to refer back to previous figures. I found that the data is rather scarce and the index of contribution is very complex, and maybe the Department of National Economy and the National Statistics Authority and others can provide the essential elements for this index, and maybe they can build up more data in the years to come to enable us to measure more accurately and determine the share of FDI and whether or not we will reach the 60% aspired percentage, which may be highly ambitious, in fact, and maybe we or not, we can achieve development through the private sector, which is not confined to local economy, but also may find some support uh, from abroad through technology and skills which can also benefit our economy. Another aspect here which I linked to the FDI as a tool and the inflows of investments, we found that in the last 50 years, the FDI targeted the oil sector by and large. This is justifiable, of course, and in most of the literature, we found, or when we tried to gauge the non-oil sector's contribution, we found that there was no breakthrough as such, and the percentage of the participation of the non-oil sector was at the minimum, and the growth rate was very ambitious, but the contribution hinged on the fluctuation of oil prices. And this shows the potential also which is there. We try to measure the situation from another angle, and that is the monetary and financial policies and whether or not they have served this purpose. We found that there are two main challenges which which are not running in the direction of benefiting the FDI and directing it to non-oil sectors, and also the banking credit in the economy, which we found is going towards the consumer side and the personal loans in particular. And we also found a very poor contribution in the balance of payment when it comes to when we look at the data from the balance of payment, we find that the service sectors have a very poor performance because of relying on the FDI to make up for the deficits. Now I move to some preliminary recommendations I am making. The first is that programs and the policies and the tools and everything to do to promote investment should be directed towards the non-oil sectors. This should be an important pillar for the work of the government in Oman and in the GCC countries as a whole. The second recommendation, that it is essential to review all the ministerial execution orders and explanatory notes should be reviewed regularly to facilitate implementation of any rules and regulations or legislation. The other recommendation is the necessity to rethinking the current distribution on banking credit and the policy of Oman in 2040 to be an important attraction, a magnet for FDI, and also um, reforming the labor market and the reforms necessary. This is important because it can serve the purpose of attracting direct foreign investment, foreign direct investment, and also it is necessary to have empirical studies which should be made to to determine the the functions of institutions and not just individuals, and rely on that to determine to what extent our economies are attractive to foreign investment or not. And more often than not, the figures and facts are misleading, and some policies may appear on the surface of it as determining factors for FDI. In fact, in reality, they have not resulted in anything substantive in the last 30 years, whether we're talking about competitiveness studies and other indicators. All this indicates that future studies should focus on the performance of institutions, which should be the cornerstone of building our future efforts to get a reasonable volume which can contribute to our national economies. Thank you for your kind attention.
Thank you very much, Mr. Muslim. Do you have any questions? Microphone, please. We would like to thank you for these valuable interventions. Mohammed Abu Zain from the Doha Institute. I have two simple comments pertaining to the two presentations. These comments perhaps lead to other questions and perhaps give us the opportunity to have much more research. So my first question is about the first presentation. The speaker talked about economic integration through initiatives of regional cooperation. So what attracted my attention in your intervention, yes, indeed, despite the shortcomings pertaining to the GCC, it is the only initiative in the region that has been fruitful compared to the Grand Maghreb Union and any other unions or cooperation. So despite everything, the GCC was able to achieve results. So the question that we pose all the time, so why such attempts? All such attempts have failed in achieving economic integration and achieving developmental projects. You mentioned the EU. The EU, for instance, started in the 50s or the 60s. It started with the coal mines. It started with a very small idea, talking about the coal mines unions. This was the beginning. And afterwards, when this integration was achieved and manifested, is it necessary to think about a kind of a bottom-up approach in the GCC? We cannot, instead of waiting for another initiative, which is a top-down kind of approach, perhaps we can change the approach in achieving this economic integration. I think it needs much more clarity and clarification. The second question that I would like to pose, yes, talking about foreign investments. This is very important, but how can we channel and direct these investments towards non-oil sectors? So we talk about investments and capital. They go to lucrative sectors, high income and profitability sectors. For an foreign investor to come to these states, they want to have a high return on those investments. So we need to show to the foreign investors higher rates of return compared to other sectors. Thank you very much for your presentations. In general, economists talk about four players: governments, local enterprises, and also the private sector. And all success stories that we read about in Singapore and other countries, they talked about investors, importers, exporters, whether through foreign investors and other kind of components. We have another component, which is the fourth component, which is globalization and technology transfer and opening up on markets through imports and exports. So this is the new philosophy that we aim to achieve in the GCC. But the problematic is that regional cooperation is very, very weak, let alone having multinational consortiums and cooperations. This is still early, so there might be sessions taking place in the Emirates, Saudi Arabia, or Qatar. Yes, this is a very important pathway. But if we say that, yes, everybody understands the importance of international integration and cooperation, a question to the two speakers. If we talk about one or two policies to reinforce such a matter, the GCC countries, despite their capital, they still need more capital, particularly when it comes to Oman. To do that, you need to have a transfer of technology to reinforce resources. So all GCC economies, they are small and they need markets, and this cannot be achieved unless there is international integration and cooperation. If you can give us an idea about a policy or two, we would like to talk only about one policy or two policies to reinforce this cooperation to attract foreign capital and investment in order to overcome the static mode that we all live in today. I have the microphone, so that's why I'm going to pose a question now. I would like to thank the two speakers. My question, I wanted to pose this question yesterday, but I didn't have the chance to do so. So throughout the papers that have been presented since yesterday, so they have not talked about the diversification of the economy and the hidden trade or invisible trade. So they have not mentioned such a concept. So perhaps we should perhaps discuss this concept of hidden, invisible trade, which is something that impacts the economies of GCC countries and also impacts the entry of our youth into the job market. And if there is a way as to how we can find a solution to this invisible or to this implicit kind of commerce, if we may call it so. We might be missing the right term that is used in economy. I have a number of observations. There is a small or seldom economists talk about economic integration. I think there is some shortage of research in terms of this matter. And the changes and variables are imposing a new reality every now and then. So that is why we have to revisit the issue of economic integration, how it is going to be achieved and so on. And economic integration or GCC cooperation both the states of Iraq and Yemen are sidelined, and they constitute a source of security concerns. And also the fourth observation, yes, we have the GCC Gulf Cooperation, which is better than other formulas. And we have seen that in times of crises or issues and problems, they have new stances and positions. Let me talk about former presidents. They had good stances. The late Sultan Qaboos, the late Emir of the State of Kuwait, they had some good initiatives. And we find that GCC people, they do not have the rapprochement that we think they have. Is it because of political reasons? I think that the people should be able to move and the formula should be from bottom top. And my observation is to Mr. Musalam. So there are question marks when it comes to FDI. So because we do not want, do not know why we need FDI. Why do we talk about FDI more than we talk about local investments? So the countries that have been successful, such as Malaysia and Singapore, they had objectives. They wanted to have knowledge transfer, know-how transfer. They wanted to serve some companies and logistical areas. So we want to know why we need to have that. So why do we need the FDI? What does it serve? My name is Imad Qaddoura. Dr. Abdullah Baaboud presented a very good intervention from what I have seen. And I hope that Dr. Baaboud would clarify. We cannot, it is difficult to link economic diversification with the external and foreign relations because economic integration, despite the fact it is very difficult to be achieved when we concentrate on particular sectors within the states. So although there is a possibility for such thing to be successful, but when it comes to foreign relations, and if we link economic diversification with foreign relations, it is going to be almost impossible to achieve, because the commercial partners outside the GCC do not prefer to have a relationship with the GCC as a whole. They prefer to have individual relations with each and every country. When it comes to negotiations with the EU, the framework agreement was signed in order to enter into negotiations. This was signed in 1987. Until now, there are negotiations taking place. And amongst the reasons is that always the EU and the United States of America and India, these are the three most important partners of the GCC, do not prefer to deal with the GCC as a council, as a group. They prefer to deal with GCC countries as individual countries. So linking economic diversification in the light of these relations is almost impossible. So India and Turkey have signed a framework agreement in order to enter into a free trade relationship with the GCC in 2004. And in excess of 15 or 16 years have elapsed, and such an aim was not achieved. And we do not think that there is any close horizon of such achievement. So I think this is going to be a difficult option for the GCC. I think it is best to concentrate on diversification inside the system, inside the countries of each and every, inside the different states of the GCC, sorry. Thank you very much. All the questions are excellent and valuable. So we're going to try to answer all these questions with regard to economic integration. We have the experience of the EU. Was it a bottom-up approach or an up-bottom approach? I think that each integration, cooperation, regional experience is different from other experiences. We cannot take an experience in this country or that country, in this place or that place, and try to implement it in our region. Yes, there are lessons learned. Undoubtedly, yes, there are lessons that we can learn from other experiences and that can be applied in each and every region, but there are particularities when it comes to each and every region. Yes, the bottom-up approach perhaps is going to be the approach for the people to push forward for such endeavors. We're talking about non-democratic countries where people do not have a voice, and there are no institutions that push for such an aim. The EU, so you talked about the coal and steel community, and the idea was that this is going to be the sector for the EU, the most important sector. So the two sectors were coal and steel. To do that, you need energy and you need steel. So if we link these two sectors to the group, so this was taken from the authority of states on these two sectors. So this is a very unique experience that cannot be replicated in other countries due to the nature of the situation, the nature of Europe at the time, and the particularity of the situation in this region. لدينا كذلك ما يسمى بأبطال or the champions of integration. So they are the pioneers or the leaders of such integration process. لدينا مثلا على سبيل المثال, so we have, for instance, Konrad Adenauer. This institute, this center is partner in this seminar. This was the foreign minister of Germany. He was pushing for economic and regional integration. And John Monnet in France. He was the first president of the coal and steel organization. So we need such pioneers. We did not have pioneers and leaders that believed in GCC Arab integration or regional integration and so on. I think that this relationship, this experience, the relationship between the state and the community, each experience is particular, is different. It has its own idiosyncrasies and particularities. So there are so many points and components that are missing. And of course, there are political differences that have also impacted the economic scene and also the will of people. There is no space for people to move and express themselves. We are peoples that are led. Tomorrow the leader would come, you should do this or that, and you would find everybody following suit and heading towards the direction that had been set and decided upon by the leader. So these things are not easy to change. You cannot change them in one night or one day. So this is also very important for development. For instance, Japan. So We have the ASEAN experience that was learned from, and also China. We have China. China is a particular and a different world altogether. So we are a small region, and the size of our economy is very, very small. And investors particularly from inside the region, would not invest in a small-scale kind of economy. This is very rare when it happens. Everybody wants to invest in larger economies. So ASEAN has not had an exclusive club, but the GCC has set an exclusive club. And even if they have set these exclusive club, you can come up with other circles of cooperation. So it is important to have regional cooperation. We cannot separate ourselves from the outside world, and investment is very important indeed. And I'm going to leave this topic to my colleague Musalam to talk about. So we have to revisit also the objective of establishing the GCC. Do we need it? Because it's almost dead. Even after the GCC reconciliation, we cannot regain trust so easily, not amongst governments and peoples, but also amongst investors and partners. On the contrary, the EU insisted of having a group kind of formula to have agreements signed with the whole region, the whole GCC. That was the objective of the EU. So they wanted to have a free trade agreement between the GCC countries as a group and the EU as a group. Yes, there are mistakes that have been committed from both sides, and also there are so many mistakes that have been committed from our side. At the end, it was the GCC that rejected the free trade agreement. The US was not enthusiastic vis-à-vis this group agreement, and they had bilateral agreements with Bahrain and Oman. But at the end, they were persuaded to have a GCC-US dialogue. So China was with us during this dialogue, and the same applies to India. So the problem is that it was us who stopped such dialogues. So the GCC needs such dialogue due to the differences we have internally. So this is what I wanted to clarify. Dr. Ahoud, you talked about implicit trade, if we may call it so, or invisible trade. So this is something that has not changed. So we need to have clarity, transparency in laws and clear laws. We do not need to reinvent the wheel. This was done and achieved years ago. But there are some reasons why development should be achieved. So there is a person that talked about 6 applications. And Ferguson, I think, Mr. Ferguson talked about 6 applications who is interested in development, the history of development. He said there are 6 applications similar to the applications you download on your phone. So the most important part of these applications is to have clarity and transparency. Giving nationality or residency to foreigners, and also to fight corruption, because a large part of this kind of trade entails to have these benefits. I hope I was able to answer your questions. So some of the questions that have been posed. So Mr. Muhammad talked about having a foreign investment channel to non-oil sectors, and he talked about investors would prefer profitable sectors, and this is true. But in my view, we do not need FDI in the oil sector. So the need our national companies to build skills and capabilities and capacities for them to be able to meet any needs when it comes to funding in the coming phase. Also, we have sovereign funds that have arms through companies in the sectors of oil and gas that can meet the needs of all investments when it comes to oil sectors. And also, we have a private sector in the GCC that can get outsourcing contracts in the oil sector. So the question mark that is being posed here, why do we need FDI in the oil sector? Perhaps in the coming phase, the strategies and policies and incentives, although there is discrimination when it comes to incentives that are channeled only to the oil sector, but we need to have procedures and also we need to activate the role of institutions to raise their capacity for us to be able to reach some objectives. If we work in one direction, this is not going to lead anywhere, but what we're supposed to do is to work in different directions. There is another question that was posed by Dr. Ahoud talking about this invisible or implicit. I really do not know what the term is, but I'm trying just to interpret or translate what is meant or what is being said in Arabic with regard to this term. So also we have the Emirates. They have a number of laws that have been issued and even in Oman. So we are still at the beginning of the road in terms of legislations and procedures. And I have followed this matter. There are also some procedures that are undertaken when it comes to opening accounts to residents in those countries and following what is happening. Some procedures have proven to be fruitful. So this is a phenomenon that has impacted the balance of pay when it comes to fund transfers that have reached high amounts of money, particularly in 2018. There is another question that was posed by Dr. Yousef, who wants us to have a specific policy or policies when it comes to overcoming the current situation and helping with the economies in this region. So these policies should concentrate on enlarging the industrial base based on the fourth industrial revolution, and the formula should be a win-win formula. The other question and the last question by Al-Kindi, Anna Al-Kindi, she said, why do we need such tools? And also, I pose another question. So these investments that are being made in the GCC, have they bridged the gap, plugged the gap that is there? So this is another question I do not have an answer to. So that is why we have to work in all directions with all tools available. So that is why we need to work on these directions to achieve development. I would like to say one word. So this region does not lack funds. This region has a lot of funds that they cannot even themselves invest and spend. Sorry, not invest, spend. So that is why they have thought about sovereign funds and investments. So there are so many investment opportunities, huge investment opportunities, and there's an opportunity for the whole region where we can have a Marshall project for the whole region to grow and develop. But foreign investment is very important in order to open markets and also to transfer technology. But foreign investors, when they think about coming, they would carry out what is called the political risk analysis. They have to assess the political situation. So if you assess the political situation, you would want to know what is happening. So the region does not need brains. We are exporting brains. What we are lacking is champions, leaders that would think in a way that would be useful to the whole region, and we need a political will. So if we achieve that, also our natural resources, our geographical location, all of these go to no avail because we do not think frankly about what we should do. Thank you very much, Dr. Abdullah. Thank you, Dr. Musalam. Thank you very much. We're going to take a 2-minute break. 10 minutes.